Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and this is one that we actually played the first part of it on my 50th birthday. We went down to Columbus, Ohio to an Irish pub called Fido's, and I sort of mentioned this already on the podcast. On the way down, we had a hose break in the engine of our van. So when we rolled into the parking lot, there was like white smoke everywhere. And we ended up being stranded at this pub like all day long. But something I feel like I didn't represent very well when I was talking about it the first time was how, because of that, our roster of players kept kind of coming and going, right? Because some of the guys are mechanics, or at the very least, they have skills that they could help the people that were the mechanics. You know what I mean? And it was kind of this big team effort. So for part of the day, people were out in this freezing cold parking lot fixing the van, right? But then they would have to go somewhere and get tools, or they'd have to go to an auto parts place to buy a hose, and then it turned out it was the wrong hose, and they had to go back and exchange it for the right kind, and you get the idea, right? So because of that, we were playing games in the pub, but it wasn't one game the whole time. It wasn't necessarily a complete game. You know what I mean? And so in the case of this one, we played part of it there. We didn't really get a chance to finish it. So then that was on Friday. And then this past Sunday, we were at my house, and then we got together to play, and not everybody could make it, you know what I mean? And so we finished it. But so the point is that this game, to me anyways, feels a little more disjointed than most of them. You'll notice that there are some characters in the beginning of the story that seem very important, and then they just kind of aren't in the story anymore the longer the story goes on. And so that's why I told you what was going on behind the scenes first, to kind of explain that. And then some of the themes in this episode, you can see how what was going on in real life also had an impact on the fiction, right? Anyways, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Before we get into the game, make sure you smash that like button. Check to see if you're still subscribed, because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you and not tell you about it. And last but not least, leave us a comment. That helps us out on our end with the YouTube algorithm, but also we genuinely love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So having said all of that, let's get into it. The prologue to today's game session takes place on Earth K, where the heroes there recently encountered Omega Corp, which is this corrupt mega corporation who has been abusing the source for personal gain. And many of the variants of Arthur then become worried that they too may have inadvertently been doing something similar, right? So one of the variants is named Omnius, and we've talked about him before on the podcast. He was one of the many Arthurs in our game. He went on a ride back in the 1970s, and by sheer coincidence, one of the other people on the ride was a man named Gary Gygax. The carnival ride kind of swept them away to this other realm of swords and sorcery and stuff like that. And while they were there, they leveled up. They ended up becoming immortals. And when I'm talking about immortals, I'm specifically referring to something that TSR published in the early 90s that was called the Wrath of the Immortals boxed set. And the concept, for anyone who's unfamiliar, at least in my humble opinion, always reminded me a lot of the Silver Surfer. So if you know the story of the Silver Surfer, he starts off as a mere mortal on another planet. He encounters this very powerful cosmic being, right? Who does something to him. He's kind of transmogrified into a cosmic being himself. Not as powerful as the one he encountered, but still, he's not what he was before, right? Well, that is exactly what the immortals do. You have some kind of a powerful immortal who is like a sponsor or a mentor kind of a figure, and they elevate a character who is mortal to become immortal, right? Well, so that is what happened to Omnius. And so then as a result of that, when they got back, by the way, Gary Gygax took inspiration from this thing that happened to him. And in our game, he made a game called Dungeons and Dragons, right? Based on what happened to him in this other world. Well, so Omnius, meanwhile, ended up having an adventure with the X-Men where they fought Dracula, because Omnius had been hunting vampires and stuff like that in the D&D world. He goes back to the X-Mansion with them. He ends up hooking up with Rogue, is the short version, right? And they have a kid named Matrix and so on and so forth. But so he's been in our game for a really long time. And so because of the problem that's going on right now, where most of the Arthurs have either absorbed the source or part of the source or whatever, what they saw happen with Omega Corp is that people who were absorbing energy from the source were mutating, and their bodies were twisted and warped. It was not a good thing. And so the Arthurs are worried not only about, what does this mean for them, but what is implied there about their kids, right? And so the solution that Omnius comes up with is, by the way, the Immortals all have what, in my humble opinion, DC would call omnipower. And in DC Heroes, omnipower can be substituted for any other power in the book, right? There's a very, very similar thing happening with the Immortals where they can substitute their power for literally any spell in Dungeons and Dragons. So, using some spells from an old book called Chronomancer, Omnius is able to travel back in time to the war between the Eldar and the Catan. And if you've been following my podcast for a while, you might know that that's actually episode number 1 on this podcast, is that war, right? It's the very, very beginning of everything for us. So he goes back to then and finds the original Arthur, right? Before Arthur split and became many Arthurs and, so on and so forth. And he turns Arthur into an immortal, right? So, and again, this is all part of my big, 50th birthday thing. At any rate, though, that's going to sound like a huge retcon, right? Here's the thing, though. Interestingly enough, it's actually not. It's not a retcon at all, and it doesn't change the timeline at all. That's really how I should refer to this. It doesn't change the timeline. Here's why. The Immortals have multiple forms that they can turn into, right? So one of those forms is called the manifestation form, and that is like this powerful cosmic thing that is like what they really are now, right? But then they have a mortal manifestation form. And the mortal form is where they like oftentimes they will become human. And there's a lot of advantages of doing that. One is that when they are human, other immortals cannot sense that they're immortal. So it's a way of hiding from their enemies. Um, I mean, I could go on and on with it, but hopefully you get the basic gist, right? So what we are saying then is that Arthur, this whole time, even though he was immortal, he didn't know he was immortal. And he's been in that mortal form, right? And all the various things, if he would absorb the source or whatever, right, it would maybe mutate his mortal body that he's currently in. But something they can do is just stop having that body. They can kind of just turn it off and the body just ceases to exist. And like their mind, in DC Heroes terms, they still have a mind, they still have a spirit attribute, but the body just goes away, right? And then they can remake a fresh body at will, free of any kind of corruption the last body experienced. It would have no disease, so on and so forth. It would be a pristine, perfect body. So the other thing is, because Omnius has access to every spell ever, that gives him abilities like mind control, right? Also, he can take away a memory. He can bestow a false memory to a target if he wants. All of that works together in concert for this whole premise that Arthur was an immortal the entire time and didn't know it, right? The other thing I liked about that, by the way, is the immortals are, because they have these mortal forms that they can assume, oftentimes they'll have more than one mortal form, and the different ones go by different names, right? And so, again, if we look at Arthur and if you look at the history of the character in our game, yes, he was known as King Arthur, and he was very kind of street level back in the days of Camelot, right? But we also said that when he first arrived on Earth, the name the Irish gave him was Dagda, and they thought he was a god, kind of a god of fertility and love and, stuff like that. But that also really fits the concept of what the immortals are, right? It's very, very on brand, that someone would mistake him for being a god. So I liked that. I felt like conceptually this was like a great way to go, right? And then once all of the many Arthurs we have running around, once they're all immortal, then they start to grant immortality to their wives, because the different ones married different women. We've certainly talked about that a ton of times in the podcast. One is married to Wonder Woman, one is married to Scarlet Witch, one is married to Supergirl, one is married to, the Invisible Woman, so on and so forth, right? Well, all of those women are granted immortality. And then all of the kids that they had together are granted immortality. And again, the concept here is kind of about that worry that some of the stuff they've done over the years in the game has brought about some kind of unwanted side effects, right? So they're trying to sort of just make sure everything's cool, with no mutation or, and any of that. So, and I mean mutation in the Omega Corp sense, where it's like a person, where what they're tampering with is actually altering reality a little bit, and they're growing a second head and stuff like that. I don't mean mutation as in, whatever Cyclops has an optic blast, or, that's not what I'm talking about. Anyway, hopefully this makes sense. If I'm not making sense to you, say something in the comments section and I'll try to clear it up, right? I'll try to do a better job. Well, okay, so then we get into the main plot of the game. All of that is kind of just setting things up. So the main plot of the game is that one of these many versions of Arthur, who's an immortal, after he has made sure his kids are immortal, he decides to go pay a visit to his old friend, the Gold Lantern, who was the original powerhouse in our game. And these days, Powerhouse lives on the farm where he grew up. And he himself has children. They now currently live in the 31st century and are members of the Legion of Superheroes. So he has empty nest syndrome. And he and his wife, who, by the way, is the 90s Supergirl, also known as the Earthborn Angel of Fire, which is kind of a mouthful, so we just call her Earth Angel for short. The two of them had been raising this alien. And the alien is a member of a race that was created by a late dear friend of mine named David Eckelberger. And they're called the Ant-Men. And they were partially inspired by the Xenomorph, but they were very, very nice guys. And they were kind of this iridescent bluish greenish color with like feathery antenna, and they were actually very, very nice and very, very polite and stuff. But like in terms of their stats, they would seem a lot like a xenomorph. And um they grow up fast like a xenomorph. So because of that, they were raising this alien baby, but it's gone now, right? It grew up. Powerhouse, by the way, used to be a Green Lantern. There was a Green Lantern named Gnort, and the Guardians, the Owens, right, the aliens that run the Green Lantern Corps, they were really into balance, and they thought that there was a place for everything in the universe, even foolishness, right? And so they realized one day they didn't have a fool in the Green Lantern Corps, and they needed one. So that's why they recruited Gnort. That's this dog-like alien that's kind of dumb, right? Well, so the rings normally have all these safeguards and guardrails and stuff that forces the user to behave a certain way. That would clash with everything that makes Gnort, right? So they had to turn all of that stuff off. And then in our game, Gnort died. Um, Actually, you know what? He died exactly 30 years ago from when we ran this game. I hadn't realized that until just now. But yeah, it was March 27th of 1996 is when Gnort died. Um, at any rate, he got into a fight with Juggernaut of all people, and Juggernaut won. And so another character in our game named Kelson Barber, he had been operating this suit of power armor. He fought Juggernaut. Juggernaut was ripping the armor off of him, so Kelson ended up uh, looting Gnort's body, taking the power ring, and then Kelson became a Green Lantern for a while. And about a year and a half later, Kelson died, and Powerhouse ended up with Kelson's old ring. And for anybody that doesn't know, in the comics in the 1990s, Hal Jordan became a villain for a while called Parallax, and he wiped out the entire Green Lantern Corps. And for a long time, there was no Green Lantern Corps. And so it was during that era that Powerhouse felt the need to make Green Lanterns, right? So we ran a whole campaign at the comic book store that I owned where everybody made a different character and they all had a Green Lantern ring, and Powerhouse was teaching them how to do all that stuff, right? Well, so the point is, he still had rings left over from that whole era, right? And he had given one to the man that he raised, the baby alien. And so it, once it reached maturity, went off into space to go have adventures with other Green Lanterns, right? So I say all this just to kind of explain the empty nest thing that Powerhouse has going on, but also to introduce the idea that he's a teacher, right? And for instance, for the 40th anniversary of our game world, we had a bunch of characters who had died in previous game sessions come back. And like one of them was Alan Scott, who was the Green Lantern of the Golden Age. He came back. He had died in 1947, so he wasn't really familiar with even television, let alone the internet, right? Or computers or cell phones or whatever. And he wasn't the only one. There were a bunch of other guys who'd been in the Justice Society, right? Which is DC's Golden Age team for the most part. And then Marvel had a Golden Age team called the Invaders. And like, some of those guys had come back to life. And so Powerhouse was teaching them about the modern world. But because the Empire now spans multiple dimensions, like one of the dimensions we mentioned in a recent game is Earth 550,000,045. And the current year there is 1945. So some of these Golden Age characters feel way more at home in a place like that. So they kind of don't want to know about laptops and cell phones and stuff. They would rather go there in a more familiar setting, right? And so because of that, he's no longer teaching either, right? He just doesn't know what to do with himself. And something we've said about him in previous games is that he feels useless and he feels kind of like a failure. And he looks at these things that he's done that have always ended, you know, and he feels like if he was good at the Green Lantern stuff, he would be a major Green Lantern to this day and so on and so forth. Or if he was good at, like he was teaching at the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. Because back in the day, he was a student. He was a member of Generation X. And he was on the team with like Jubilee and Husk and Skin and characters like that, right? So then years later, he went back and he became a teacher at the Xavier School. But it came to an end, right? And so he saw that as a failure. And he thought if he'd been a good teacher, he would still be there. You get the idea. So so the day comes when Arthur knocks on his door and he invites him in, and the wife, Earth Angel, she's there. They all sit down in the living room together, and Arthur starts to explain the whole situation with Omega Corp and the source and all those mutations and how the people who had source stuff were like twisted and warped and it was bad, right? And so Arthur explains the solution of turning people into immortals and yada yada yada, right? And so when Arthur's saying, he does this segue basically where he says, I'm making sure my family are all immortal. Then he transitions and he tells Powerhouse that to him Powerhouse feels like a brother and he wants to make Powerhouse immortal even though they're not, related by blood or anything. And so Powerhouse starts to vocalize how he feels like a failure and, how all this stuff always ends. He feels like nothing ever works out for him. And Arthur completely flips that. And his take on it is Like, for instance, when the universe needed Green Lanterns, Powerhouse did it. When the Justice Society needed caught up to speed, Powerhouse did it, right? So his thing is not like judge yourself by the how permanent your role is so much as you're you're doing whatever needs done, right? And that has value. And so that was kind of cool. It was sort of like a cool twist on things. And so Earth Angel then speaks up about this whole immortality thing and says, this is a big shock and I've got a million questions and so on and so forth. So Arthur says, "Why don't you two let me take you out to the new CB&G, which is an Irish pub, which again, we were playing the game in an Irish pub at the time, right? So he's like, "Why don't you let me take you out? We'll discuss it over drinks and, you know, let's do this." So Arthur teleports the two of them to Liscarroll, Ireland, which, by the way, the Immortals have unlimited teleportation. So he teleports them there, and there's the pub is dark and locked and all that stuff. So Arthur goes up and unlocks the front door, and they all walk in, and Arthur flips the light switch, and here in the pub is pretty much everybody Powerhouse has ever met, and they all yell surprise. And on the bar is a cake that says happy birthday, happy 50th birthday, Powerhouse. And his two oldest friends, Jay and Ryan, also known as Umbra and Pulsar, they kind of clap him on the back. And Pulsar is actually a month older than Powerhouse, and Umbra is a year older than Powerhouse. So they kind of welcome him to old age. Um, and Powerhouse explains to his wife, by the way, that this is the Irish pub where he and Umbra, who was called Shadowstorm at the time, they came here on vacation right after they graduated from high school. It was actually the last game that Umbra's player ever ran. He was the GM before me. But they came here, and due to a misunderstanding, Umbra went home without him. And so Powerhouse was stuck here for a while, and he was a bartender in this very pub, right? He had to earn the money to be able to go home. But it was like a fairly major thing in our game, but it took place right here. And this pub used to be called Callahan's before Arthur bought it and turned it into a CB&G. And then Arthur comments that the pub meant a lot to him too, because back in the BC era, he and Wonder Woman were an item, and then they broke up at one point and were separate for centuries. But then when World War II happened, and Wonder Woman, comes to America for the first time, and she joins the Allied forces to help fight the Axis powers. Arthur was also fighting the Axis powers. FDR actually drafted all the world's superheroes into one group called the All-Star Squadron. So they were both in that group. And the first time then they met as teammates was here in this bar, that their military guys that were giving the superheroes orders just told both of them, be here on this date at this time, and your person you're going to be working with is going to be there, and then we got a mission for you guys to go on. That was right here, right? So it has meaning for him then as well, right? Anyway, um everybody gets to talking then. And one of the things that Pulsar mentions is he starts talking about the thing with the clones. that happened not too awful long ago, and how he was forced to use this orange gas to take out these clones. And it really, really, really bothered him because there was an old adventure where he encountered clones of himself, and Kelson used the orange gas on those clones, and then those two hated each other ever since, right? And so now in a recent adventure, Ryan was forced to use the orange gas. So he's actually thinking about retiring. And like I said, he also just turned 50, right? So he's thinking about just hanging it up and saying, I'm done wearing costumes and just I had my run, you know. Um so that is one of the many things happening. There's like a just a million conversations all kind of happening at once here. Bubble Girl was one of Powerhouse's students at the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. So she comes over and she gives Powerhouse a hug, wishes him a happy birthday. She's here with her boyfriend Trace, who is a clone of Arthur. And then somebody else who's here is Trace's ex-girlfriend, Nochtkind, aka Erica Musterman, which is a German name, by the way. Uh, and she, by the way, is also featured in the art for this episode. Anyways, so Nochtkin had just quit being a student at the Xavier School when Powerhouse began teaching there. But she had a long lost twin brother named Axel. He was one of the students of Powerhouse before he went off and became a supervillain with the powers of Shazam. Uh, and then some of those other students from that era are here, like Alex Cooper, aka Nemesis. He has omnipower, but the catch is that he can only substitute it for the opposite of whatever he's going up against. So if he's fighting a fire person, that round he would get ice powers, if somebody had gravity increase, he would then get gravity decrease, stuff like that. Um, at any rate, so all these students are here, and Nochtkind sees that Trace and Bubble Girl are an item. And so she goes over to Trace and she asks how long this has been going on. And Trace reminds her that she broke up with him. But Nochtkin says that from her, view of things, her family's villainy was hard for her to deal with. So she needed a minute to clear her head, basically. But she says she was going to come back to him after she'd done that. So then Trace feels guilty, right? Like he cheated on her or something, even though he didn't. And then Bubble Girl sees the look on Trace's face. And so she's like, hey, what are you doing? Right? And then he tries to defend himself. He says, I didn't even say anything. And Bubble Girl's like, actually, you said a lot with just your facial expression. Body language is still communication. So those two, I don't want to say they fight. They don't fight, but they're having a little back and forth as a couple, right? So Nochtkin backs off, right? Lets them do that. And she notices Sean MacArthur, who is a newer character in the game. And as it just so happens, Sean MacArthur looks exactly like Trace. So Nochtkin kind of has a type, I guess you could say. So she goes over and she starts to flirt with Sean, which Trace sees. And it makes Trace feel a little weird to see an ex with somebody else, right? So again, he's got a look on his face that makes Bubble Girl kind of jealous and angry and stuff like that. And she's not the only one who's jealous and angry. By the way, Nochtkind and Bubble Girl are played by my wife. Then my wife also plays a werewolf, a female werewolf named Anne, whose father is the leader of the Fianna pack of werewolves that hang out at this pub all the time. And then there's a female changeling gadgeteer and her kith is that she's a goblin, which they're also sometimes called gremlins. They're very short, they have green skin. She's very pretty, though. She's not like monstrous or anything. And her name is Siobhan O'Rourke. And so, as they see Sean MacArthur getting hit on by Noctkind, they don't like that because both Anne and Siobhan have a thing for MacArthur, right? Where they want to be with him. And so as they're kind of watching this interaction, Noctkin says, she goes to college in Germany now. She's in a sorority, and there's this nightclub where her and her sorority sisters go all the time. And she says they more or less invented techno. And the whole place has got like a lot of neon and, so on and so forth. A very cool club scene. And she's like, we should go there. You should see it. And so Sean, who, by the way, part of his thing is he likes to travel, he's into that. So as they start to leave, the Goblin Girl decides to try to cockblock Noctkind by tagging along, right? Which Noctkind doesn't appreciate. And then the Goblin Girl, just being even more of a wet blanket, basically invites all of the young characters from this scene to tag along, right? So they use the bar door of the Irish CB&G, and we've talked about the bar door a bunch of times over the years in the game, how it can connect to other bar doors, right? So they go to this place called Drifters Club in Germany, and it's in a town called Freiburg im Breisgau. And at any rate, so Noctkin and Sean are dancing. There's a couple of changelings. One's a red cap, and the other's a troll. They're playing pool. The one of them is trying to be kind of a pool shark and get a local guy that was kind of a douche. They're like kind of swindling him out of his money. Um, and then Anne, the werewolf, and Siobhan, the goblin, are still trying to thwart all of Noctkin's attempts to get with Trace. Excuse me, not Trace. I meant to say Sean. Sorry. So then a bunch of the male characters here feel kind of left out. So Noctkin calls the sorority girls. They show up, and some of my listeners will be familiar with these old beer commercials that featured something called the Swedish Bikini Team. That is exactly what I ripped off here. So these sorority girls all have, blonde hair and blue eyes, and they're buxom, and they're party girls, so they've got big steins of German beer and so on and so forth. And so the boys are loving this, right? And they're getting all this attention. But again, Noctkind is like hot to trot, man. So she wants to get Sean alone. And she's like, why don't we sneak off into the woods? And so the goblin sees this, and she's like, hey, everybody, let's go take this party to the woods. And by the way, when I say the woods, what I'm actually talking about here is the Black Forest in Germany. And again, if you followed the podcast long enough, that might ring a bell because we've mentioned the Black Forest in 100 different games because a lot of the old Grimm's fairy tale stuff was supposed to take place in the Black Forest. So we ran like a more serious D&D version of Hansel and Gretel at one point. We've done like Men in Black stuff in the Black Forest with like uh, Sasquatch and stuff like that. So it's full of like dangerous cryptids and like weird magical monsters and things like that, right? But the majority of the people right now don't know that. They're just like, yeah, let's go party in the woods. So they do. They go there and they they have a bonfire. There's kind of a big, really big actually, round clearing, and in the very center of that they have this bonfire going, huge bonfire, and they're around it drinking, and they're playing music and they're laughing, and people start to make out and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And it's all these tropes kind of like from horror movies. So some of the players start to feel like they're in danger, like rightly so. And um I think it was the goblin at one point decides she wants to find a small stone because she wants to throw it at Noctkin because she's mad that what Noctkin is doing is working, right? And so she's like, I want to pick up a rock. And I told my wife, I said, well, your character's like really short, and the grass here is like chest high on a normal person, so it's probably over your head. And it's really thick, lush, green grass. And so she's like, well, I want to like search the ground. And she bends down and she starts searching the ground. And I tell her, there's an awful lot of ash in this location for some reason, which of course makes the ground more fertile, makes stuff grow better, so on and so forth. And she's kind of like, why is there so much ash here? And so some of the players start looking around and they find foundation stones where there used to be buildings. This used to be a village until relatively recently. There was a village here. And all of a sudden, Brad realizes where they're at. And a year ago to the day, I ran a game. And it was a bunch of these characters were in this game because it was when Powerhouse was teaching. The player characters were members of the New Mutants at the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. And this rabbit guy shows up at the mansion asking for help. And they came here looking for his daughter. And the plot of that game was based on a movie called The Wicker Man, where there's these girls and they're in a cult and they lure men to the village to reproduce with them to make more girls. And then they sacrifice the men afterwards. And if girls who are outsiders show up, then they have no use for them and they sacrifice them too, right? But we had put a whole Easter spin on it, right? So the idea was that the goddess that these uh, girls were worshiping was named Eoster, which a lot of people think is where we get the word Easter from. That's debatable. I'm not saying it's true, but there was, a pagan goddess named Eoster, and she was a fertility figure, right? And so then a lot of the symbols associated with that are like rabbits, because of course we've all heard how rabbits breed like crazy, right? And eggs, because it represents new life and so on and so forth. So you get it, right? And by the way, we've got that video on the channel. And that video ended with they all got back to well, first of all, Powerhouse's wife, Earth Angel, used her fire powers to burn down this whole village, right? And then they went back to the X Mansion, and just when they thought everything was fine and we were in epilogue territory, that bunny guy, who by the way had gone insane from them trying to sacrifice him, he got a dagger plunged into his heart, a sacrificial dagger, by the daughter that they had been looking for, right? Well, so now what happens is we find out that this was never Nochtkind. The real Nochtkind is someplace else entirely, right? The girl who's been masquerading as Nochtkind is the rabbit's daughter, right? She is the new leader of this cult. These are not sorority girls. They're all were-rabbits. And by the way, the White Wolf RPG, they put out a book for were-rabbits. So that's what we were using for the stats for these guys. And one of the gifts that they give the were-rabbits is a little bit of super speed. So what we find out is back at that German nightclub when the guys were looking away, like one girl would do a sexy dance or something, and the guys would be checking her out, one of the other girls would be using that super speed to drop stuff in their drinks that was a drug because they want to make them sleepy, right? Because then the plan is for them to tie those guys up, breed with them to make more, were rabbits. Ideally, they would love to have were rabbits that have superpowers, they'd be into that. They also put stuff in the drinks of the girls, wanting them to go to sleep, just to eliminate them, because obviously they can't reproduce with them. Um, I feel like I'm leaving something out. Oh yeah. So the person they thought was Nochtkind was wearing an image inducer because the rabbit's daughter, when she went to the Xavier school, like I said, Nochtkind had just left, and Nochtkind had an image inducer previously. And she left it there when she left the team because she felt like it wasn't really her property. But it uses holograms to make her look more normal because Nochtkind has like white skin and weird colored eyes and stuff like that. So she would use the image inducer to look normal. But then the other part of that was for it to kind of know what to do with her appearance, it also had to know exactly all the dimensions of her face and stuff to like put that new color scheme over top of it. Does that make sense? So the idea is not only did it have her human appearance stored in the device, but also her what she normally really looks like. So when the rabbit girl took it, that was how she was able to impersonate Nochtkind. And then we said she also used the computers there to learn all about the various students and stuff. So that's how she knew Nochtkind and Trace had been boyfriend and girlfriend, right? At any rate, so that's like this big reveal. And so essentially, you could split the party in half and basically say half of them have systemic antidote, which protects them from toxins and drugs and stuff like that, and they don't fall asleep, right? The other half of the party falls asleep because they didn't have the power they needed to stay awake. And then everybody who's awake rolls initiative. We have this big battle then. I should also say there's one character who did not have systemic antidote, but didn't fall asleep either. And it was one of the changelings, is this girl named Bonnie O'Hare. And her changeling kith is that she's a puka. And they are the animal themed changelings. And it's my daughter's character. And when she made her, I said, "What kind of animal do you want to be?" And she chose a rabbit. And then, depending on which of the changeling books you read, some of them suggest that the werewolves from White Wolf are actually the descendants of the Pukas, suggesting they're related, right? Something else that I was doing in this adventure was suggesting that the changelings themselves are the descendants of the immortals. And so, like we mentioned earlier, immortals have unlimited teleportation. Changelings have access to a thing called flicker flash, which gives them also unlimited teleportation. And that is kind of the punchline to this whole thing. That's what my daughter does. It's her new favorite thing to do is use flicker flash to put an enemy into the sun. So that's what she does to every single one of these rabbit villains, including the one who had been disguised as Nochtkind. So yes, we had this big battle. Everybody was hitting and doing certain amounts of damage. It was a struggle actually for the characters to deal with this huge number of were-rabbits, right? But they did. Eventually, they wipe them all out. And it's kind of ironic that last year they took out the village, like the buildings, with fire. This year it was the characters. So at the end of the game, it seems like there's no rabbit villains left at all. Um, then we get into the epilogue, and the epilogue was just a logistics problem. They had a bunch of people that were knocked out. The troll comes to mind because he's like the size of the Incredible Hulk. right? And so if you're like a little bunny girl Puka, like my daughter was, then it's like, what do you do with the Hulk? Because their original idea was let's pick him up and let's take him back to town and use a bar door to get back to the CB&G. But then they were talking about how if you are carrying an unconscious body through town, someone's going to think you're up to no good and a crime took place and you're going to get stopped and questioned and blah, 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 right? And so they're like, so what do we do? What I forgot was in an earlier adventure, I gave everybody these necklaces made of bottle caps, where every individual bottle cap has a point of glamour stored in it, which is the fuel that changelings use to do all of their things they do. Because of that, then my daughter was able to just teleport all these guys one at a time back to the CB&G. So that kind of ruined my logistics thing, but yeah, that was it. I feel like this game went really well. The disjointed part is not great because we were playing it on like 2 different days and stuff like that. But I feel like anything negative about it was like overshadowed by the big reveal that this was actually an Easter adventure, right? And that they were in the Easter village and didn't realize it at first. And, that was really cool. The reveal that Nochtkind was not actually Nochtkind was like really cool. The fact that she knew about Trace at the beginning made them not question whether she was real or not. The fact that we led with the birthday of Powerhouse also got people thinking, oh, that's what this game is about. And they didn't question the fact that we were playing it this time of year, right? And that it might be the return of the were rabbits. Um, Also, the whole were rabbit thing was kind of inspired by an old Dungeons and Dragons meme because in D&D all the time you have to go fight these eldritch horrors and disgusting slime monsters and stuff like that. So in this old meme, they said, "Why is there never a fluffy bunny cult?" And that was actually the inspiration for this way back when. That's where we got a lot of these ideas from. So, but of course, we took something humorous and then we tried to make it serious. So it went really well. We had fun on our end. We hope that you had a good time hearing about it. If so, as always, smash like. Uh, Make sure you're subscribed and leave us a comment. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.